Thank you, Andrew, and good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce a former CI colleague, Valerie Plame. We never worked together. I was chasing Russians while she was chasing nuclear proliferators, but our training, tradecraft, and operational experiences were very similar. Valerie Plame was born in Anchorage, Alaska. Her father was in the Air Force. She went to high school in Pennsylvania. She then received her degree in journalism from Penn State University. Valerie has 2 master's degrees, one from the London School of Economics and one from the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium. Valerie was a CIA undercover case officer from 1985 to 2006. Her specialty was nonproliferation and included assignments in European locations. Valerie's cover was blown in an article by Robert Novak in 2003, which ended her undercover career. After she left the CIA, she moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she currently lives. Valerie's autobiography, Fair Game, My Life as a Spy, My Betrayal by the White House, appeared in 2007. And in 2010, her book was the basis for the movie of the same name, Fair Game, starring Naomi Watts as Valerie and Sean Penn as Joseph Wilson. Valerie has also written 2 spy novels. I find this very interesting, which have done very well. One called Blowback in 2013 and one called Burned in 2015. Valerie is currently involved in a very exciting project called Spies, Lies, and Nukes, which is a series of conferences around the country on intelligence topics. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Bush School and Texas A&M welcome to Valerie Plame.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am really delighted to be here, and I have to say I'm not unaware of the irony that I am speaking at the Bush Public School for School for Public Service. I want to be absolutely clear that I have nothing but the highest regard for President George H.W. Bush. My goodness, he served our country so well, so long, with such grace. He was a beloved director of the CIA. And he just had such qualities of grace and civility. And an example of that is when Joe Wilson came out of Baghdad. He was the acting ambassador after the first Gulf War. The president called him a true American hero. And Joe went to the Rose Garden and met, in fact, with General Skoskovsky and President Bush. And the president wrote Joe a thank you note, thank you for coming, and just so kind. And when the president writes you a note, you write a note back. And this president, because how he'd been raised and his qualities of kindness and politeness and civility, he wrote a thank you note for the thank you note. And then, because as a president, you have to say thank you for me. So we have a stack of correspondence like that. And I'm also delighted to say that I made the acquaintance of General Brent Scowcroft, for which the Institute is named, right before I left Washington, D.C. to move to New Mexico. He invited me to come have lunch at his offices in downtown D.C., and I'm proud to say I shared a sandwich with him. I was so nervous. He was such a huge name in national security for so long. Again, what he had done for our country. I was so nervous I thought I was going to fall out of my shoes. So I'm just absolutely delighted that I am here this evening. My name is Valerie Plame. You shouldn't know that, but you do. My story is a story of power, the abuse of power, the price of speaking truth to power. And although the story that I'm going to tell you this evening, at least part of it, it played out in an intensely partisan fashion, the issues themselves are not political. I was truly honored to serve my country as a covert CIA operations officer. It was a career I loved. I was highly trained for it. And it all ended rather abruptly one July day, 2003, when senior officials in the Bush White House betrayed my true CIA identity for their own partisan agenda. It really was, in my mind, political payback for my then husband, Joe Wilson, his public questioning of the reasons that we were told as the American public that we went to war in Iraq. You may remember, if you were watching the news at that time, that we were told Iraq presented an imminent nuclear threat, and we don't want to see the smoking gun in the shape of a mushroom cloud. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of my story. Let me back up a little bit, tell you a little bit about why I joined the CIA, how that came to be, and what I did. I come from a family of public service, quietly, but it was always considered to be something worthwhile. My father was an Air Force officer. He served in World War II in the South Pacific. My brother was a Marine. He served in Vietnam. He was wounded there. And my mother was a public school teacher. So when I was given this opportunity at a very young age to join the CIA, I really jumped at it. And corny as it sounds, it spoke to me about serving something much bigger than myself. I love the idea that the government was going to pay me to live and work abroad. And to be perfectly honest, it sounded like it was a lot more exciting than what a lot of my friends were doing at the time. So let me just walk you through a little bit of the hiring process to get into the CIA. As you might imagine, it's rather long, anywhere from 6 to 8 months, sometimes longer. You got to go through a lot of hoops. There are a lot of interviews. There are a lot of multiple choice exams. Of course, you have security background checks, medical, psychological, all sorts of things. And I remember one incident where I guess she was a psychologist, but she may have been a case officer. I never saw her again. But we were sitting at the table, and she's giving me a variety of scenarios and just asking, well, what would you do? How would you how would you handle this situation, this situation, this situation? And the final one she gave me, she said, what would happen if you are meeting a very sensitive asset in a hotel room, and suddenly you hear at the door, police, open up, what do you do? And I gotta tell you, I was not terribly worldly, but at least I had the presence of mind to realize there's really only one good reason that a man and a woman are in a hotel room together. And I said to this very proper lady with pearls and a twin set, I said, I would start unbuttoning my blouse and take it off, and make it look like I was having an affair. And she just, noted that. And so it really was a blur. This went on for months like this. And of course, they never tell you how you're doing, except if they ask you to do the next thing. It really was a blur, but there's still one question to this day I will always, and I will remember as long as I live, one of the questions on the multiple choice exams was, do you like tall women? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if you had that question, Jim. In any case, they recruited me to go into the Directorate of Operations. And that is the core of the agency's work, their raison d'etre. That's what the Directorate of Operations does. And I was in the vanguard of women that were recruited specifically to go into operations. Because prior to that, for the most part, most women that were in operations really had started in more support roles. They were the secretaries or the safe housekeepers or perhaps the translators or something, something that wasn't operations. And they looked at their male counterparts and they said, now that's way more fun. and they worked their way up. But thank goodness the CIA, along with a lot of other organizations, corporate America at this time, realized, we really need to have a more diverse workforce. It's not only, it's the right thing to do, and it has a benefit of being much more effective. So I came in that initial wave of women that were trained to go into operations. Let me just speak very briefly about how the CIA is set up so you can understand where I was. There's 4 main directorates. There's the Directorate of Operations, and that's where the spy stuff happens. That's where you recruit foreigners to provide, hopefully, really good intelligence for our senior U.S. policymakers. There's the Directorate of Intelligence, the DI. Those are the analysts. Those are where the people, all the information is coming in from around the world, and it's coming from a variety of sources. It might be clandestine sources, but it's also coming, say, from signals intelligence or from overt news from around the world. They're taking in all this information, corroborating it, and putting it together, and then disseminating it back out into the intelligence community. There's a Directorate of Science and Technology, and anyone who has ever watched a James Bond film knows that full well that those are the shoe phone people, okay? And then you have the Directorate of Administration, and they're the folks that make this truly worldwide organization run. So I was destined to go into the Directorate of Operations. Within that, it was primarily divided into, as you might imagine, geographic divisions, the European division, the Soviet division at the time, and so on. But something happened in 1995, and the CIA set up a counterproliferation division, and this was very different than what had gone before, not geographically based. In 1995, there was a sarin gas attack on a Tokyo subway. Some of you may recall that. And I think it's fair to say that it was the first time that the U.S. government as a whole sat up and took notice of this emergent threat, WMD, weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear. Because prior to that, at least my observation was that there was someone over here in this department that followed this, and there was another person over here. There was no systemic way of looking at these transnational issues of WMD. The CIA had already set up something similar in the Counterterrorist Center, and so they did this in a counterproliferation division. And what happened in the Counterterrorist Center was for the first time, the CIA actually put people like myself or Jim, operations folks, in the same room, at the same table with analysts. Because prior to that, there was almost a line down the middle of the headquarters building. One side was operations, one side was analyst. But thank goodness they figured out that the best product, the best intelligence, oftentimes comes from that synergy. So that's where I was. Let me go backward in time again, though, a little bit, because I want to tell you a little bit about my training and my time at the farm. The first, as you're given your job offer, they bring everyone in, and you're coming from all these directorates, not just the DO, the Director of Operations, all of you. And you are sent to the farm, which is a place outside of Washington, D.C. And you go through very much paramilitary training, Quonset huts, military fatigues, running at 5 a.m. in formation, that sort of thing. And I got to do really, I think, cool stuff, like parachute out of airplanes, fire an impressive array of automatic weapons, and I just want to say, apparently I'm a really good shot, which is, I would just call it a beginner's luck, okay? We got to blow stuff up. They made sure we went through what would now be called enhanced interrogation techniques, and we practiced survival skills for weeks at a time in the woods. Quick story, as I was undergoing, and they make it truly try to make it as believable as possible. So when this group, went going through interrogation exercises, and this is going on for almost a week, it's somewhere between 3 and 5 days. Who knows? It was all a blur, a lot of sleep deprivation in there. But they try to make it as realistic as possible. You are truly, truly uncomfortable. But at least for me, I mean, I knew that they weren't going to kill us because they had already spent all this money on me, you know, and they're not going to do that. But you're deeply uncomfortable. There's a reason they use sleep deprivation as a torture device, because it so profoundly changes who you are and your sense of well-being. But I guess I knew that I kind of had a pretty good streak of resilience in me, because I remember very clearly being in a dark, isolated chamber. I won't say more about that. But as I was, passing the time, I'm sort of doing my Christmas card list in my head, alphabetically. And then I went back and did it the other way. It's just, what can you do to find the time or to pass the time? The whole reason that they do this very expensive, intensive paramilitary training is not because they expect you to be dropped behind the lines in Mother Russia. Not at all. That's never going to happen. However, the instructors there are evaluating you very, very closely. Even though you've already been through this intensive interview intake process, there's nothing like seeing what someone's going to be like when you've been, sort of living in a swamp for a couple days. And you really do know who of your colleagues is going to be there when they say they will be there, who is responsible, because the idea being that this group of people you will grow up with as you go through into the senior ranks of the agency. So it's building that esprit de corps, and it's also allowing headquarters to take another look at you before you're expected to go out and do whatever job you were hired to do. So those of us that were hired to go into operations, and I said I was one of them, after you finish that whole paramilitary stuff, you go into ops training, again at the farm. This is where you learn the real spy stuff, the tradecraft stuff. It's the core business of being a spy. It's how to recruit a foreigner so that they will betray their country and provide good intelligence for our national security. You learn how to spot, assess, develop, and recruit. That is the classic recruitment cycle that I'm sure is taught in many a class here. So the things that I learned how to do there was how to spot and evade surveillance, because keeping your asset, the person who's actually spying for you, safe is of paramount importance. And you should know how to conduct counter-surveillance so that you do not get caught by the Foreign Intelligence Service. You need to understand how to write good intelligence reports, because as an instructor told me, if you didn't write it up, it didn't happen. Which of course cuts both ways, but if you didn't write it up, it didn't happen. You need to be able to very succinctly explain, here's what's going on in the case, and here's the intelligence. I can take covert photographs from a modified purse. I can communicate with assets with using dead drops, which I was so delighted to hear you get to do in your class as well, Professor Olson. And I can also kill someone with my bare hands. I'm just kidding. Everyone's like, really? I'll tell you one quick story about that. As we were toward the end of our training at the farm, and this is going on for several months, there was an exercise where you had to go off, as you always do to do a lot of these operations. You go off the farm perimeter, you go into the nearby town, and when you came back to do whatever operational act there was, and in this case, it required that you had a disguise and all of that stuff. So when you came back on base, on this area, the farm, they had set up a very realistic roadblock. Police, you immediately, the pucker factor goes up, they stop you, they're sort of swarming you, and they are filming this, and they're asking you, what do you have, what are you doing, you're a spy, aren't you, what's going on, why? And as I say, they're filming all this. So naturally, they're using this as a heuristic device, and they show this video the next day in class in a room much like this. There's a big video screen, and they go through, and they show many, many people how they responded under this unexpected and very fear-inducing environment, that situation. And something comes up. It was my friend Andy. Now, Andy, by the way, went on to receive the highest intelligence medals the CIA can give. He then went over to the Pentagon later in his career. He ended his government career as an Undersecretary of State for WMD. Amazing guy. But he's sitting next to me in my class, and his mug flashes up on the screen, and he sort of slithers down in his chair. He's like, oh no. And sure enough, they show him, get out of the car. What is all this? So they flip the trunk of his car open, and he hadn't done a very good job of hiding his disguise. I mean, there's like a wig and makeup and all stuff he shouldn't be having. And the camera is trained on Andy's face, and you can hear the orders being barked, just the tension, the orders and the questions being barked at him. What is this? How do you explain this? And Andy just takes a deep breath, and he says, my wife likes me to dress up. And what was so funny, the cameraman was laughing so hard. If you have Andy here, don't tell him I told you that story. It was very good. So in my career, after I did get out of the farm, I got to travel the world and recruit spies on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency. I developed an expertise in nuclear counterproliferation, which essentially means I made sure that terrorists, black marketeers, rogue nation states did not get a nuclear capability. I loved what I did. Every once in a while, I thought it was really, really worthwhile. I was also involved in some highly secretive cyber operations against a range of targets. Now, let me take you and refresh your memory. Maybe for some of you, you're not really sure who I am except Valerie Plame, the CIA, but let me explain why you know my name at all. And I'm going to take you to the days just after 9/11. We were at war. There is no question about that. In the CIA, people were sleeping underneath their desks. At the time, there were unexplained anthrax attacks, or people were, elected officials were receiving envelopes full of anthrax. There was such a sense of a whole different world. Everyone knew that. We didn't know what it would be. And the smoke was literally still clearing from the World Trade Towers in New York when then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld opened up a map of Iraq at Camp David. And he said, there's really not that many targets in Afghanistan. But in Iraq, now there we have some, it's a target-rich environment. In response to the administration's desire to explore the possibilities of conflict with Iraq and what would that mean and why and so forth, the CIA set up an Iraq task force. And its mission was to find out the presumed WMD, and in particular, presumed nuclear capabilities of Iraq. Because the truth is, we had very little intelligence on Iraq at that time. If you recall, in 1998, Saddam Hussein kicked out the UN weapons inspectors. So we didn't have that ability to really even see from that angle what Iraq might have. Certainly we didn't have an embassy there since the first Gulf War in 1990, 91. So we had very little intelligence. I was asked to come in and work on this task force, and I remember asking for, okay, well, let's get going. Let's see the files we have. And I was astonished at sort of the the dusty onion paper files that I got. I'm like, this is it? You're kidding me. This is it? We had nothing. But the job of what my group was to figure out who were the key scientists, what were they doing in terms of nuclear program, how were they procuring the material, How were they financing all this? What was, get going. So let me take you to February 2002. So this is just a couple months after the 9/11 attacks. And I, at that time, was working at the CIA headquarters. And I remember I was speaking with a young woman who was working for me. And she was very upset because she was quite junior, but she had just received a phone call from the office of the vice president asking about these reports of yellow cake uranium, 500 tons, being moved from Niger in West Africa to Iraq. Now, if that was true, that would be really significant because it would be further proof, it would seem, that in fact Saddam Hussein was seeking to reconstitute his nuclear program. Yellow cake uranium is a highly refined form of uranium, and it's used in that process. And I have to tell you, at that time, I was really more taken by the fact that someone from the White House was calling some very lowly government worker. There's protocols in place when there's a senior member of the administration that has an intelligence question, it gets asked, it goes down the chain, it gets answered, it goes back up the chain. So I was taking this in, and a fellow comes by, a reports officer, and he says, well, he hears what's going on. He said, well, why don't you have Joe Wilson, my husband at the time, to go check out this report? Because he knew that Joe had served both in Niger as a U.S. diplomat, and he had served as our acting ambassador in Iraq. He had done already some shall we say, classified or just very quiet missions for the CIA, that he was a known figure. And I said, well, I don't know, so let's just go ask the boss. Which we did, and my boss said, Valerie, when you go home tonight, could you just ask Joe to come into headquarters next week? We'll get the right people around the table, and we'll figure out what should we do? What's the right thing to do? And that's what I did. I went home, he came in, I was not at that meeting. It was determined that he should go to Niger to figure out, if he could, anything more about these reports, because I can tell you, it's in the DNA of the agency that when a senior administration official asks any kind of question, we try to do anything we can to answer it. So Joe goes off to Niger. He speaks to his contacts there. He had a great deal of credibility because he had served in Clinton's NSC, and in that capacity, he had essentially convinced the Niger leadership to move from a military dictatorship to civilian. So he was known and he was respected. So he came back and he was debriefed by some intelligence analysts. And he said, look, there is nothing to this report. And here's why. It's totally bogus. Okay, and in fact, his report matched, there were some others as well in the intelligence stream that said that this is bogus reporting. And that he was, by that point in time, he was out of the State Department. He was working as a private consultant. I went back, I wasn't involved in that at all, other than having him come in. I was glad that he was asked to do something, he could do something, and everything moved on. Everything was moving very, very quickly. So let me fast forward now to almost a year later, January 2003, and President W. Bush gives his State of the Union address. And he uses the phrase, and it became sort of infamous 16 words, that the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium in Africa. And when I heard that, I was like, yeah, I remember Joe going there last, but who knows? Uranium is actually, curiously enough, a very common mineral on this earth. And there are other countries in Africa that mine this. So, who knows what the president was referring to. Then, a few weeks later, our then Secretary of State, Colin Powell, gave his speech before the United Nations. His job was to convince the world why America was going to go to war in Iraq. And For those of you that were watching the news, I don't know about you, but I was certainly watching with rapt attention because Colin Powell had such presence and such, he was just, his reputation was sterling. And I really wanted to hear what he had to say. And I remember watching his speech at CIA headquarters with my colleagues, and among other things, he spoke about a BW, biological weapons, asset codenamed Curveball, and how Curveball was really, this was really proof positive that Iraq had a BW capability, and I don't know if my intake of breath was audible, but it felt that way, because Curveball, at that point, that asset had been completely discredited. He was a known drunkard, a fabricator. His reporting had been pulled back in, basically stamped liar or fabricator. I forget what exactly they put on reports. And here, the Secretary of State is using him as an example of BW in Iraq. What did that mean for all the other claims he was making? It was astonishing. And I experienced what I can only describe as cognitive dissonance, right? How can this possibly be? But I went back to my desk and I just kind of felt sick. I felt sick. I felt sick to my stomach because up to that point, I had been dealing so intensely in operations. I was trying to make sure that the right people were at the right place, and I had an Arabic translator over there, and I had money over there, and I had a case officer on an airplane over there. And all of a sudden I pulled back and I went, whew. I remember feeling the only thing that I could really hope for was that there were people that were way more senior than I was, that were in the president's circle, that had information that I was not privy to, because when you take your country to war, that is the most sacred and the biggest decision you will ever make. So I had to hope that that is what had happened. And of course, we went to war, shock and awe, March 2003. For the younger people in the audiences, I'm sure there's YouTube video of that. So the war goes on, few months. Combat operations wind out pretty quickly, but insurgency begins to ramp up. And by June, it's pretty much chaos in Iraq, and no WMD has been found. And there's sort of a story bubbling around, quietly at first, but talking about a former ambassador who had been to Niger, and there was nothing to these claims, and so forth. And although so much has since subsequently been distorted, I can tell you that Joe Wilson had no partisan intent when he decided to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times. It came out in July, was entitled "What I Did Not Find in Africa." He felt that he needed to hold his government to account for its words and deeds. And he knew this information about this trip. I mean, he wasn't providing any classified information, but he was saying, I did this, and the information showed that there was no transfer of yellow cake uranium, and furthermore, I think the intelligence was somewhat cooked up around all the reasons that we were told, the American public was told, we're going to go to war in Iraq. So the White House did not take that very well. The very next day, they did issue what amounted, if you will, to some semblance of an apology, and they said those 16 words in the President's State of the Union address did not rise to the level that it should have. And Joe thought he had done what he was supposed to do as a citizen, and he was ready to just, go back to work. But what happened was a week later, a conservative columnist who's now gone, Robert Novak, wrote a column, and in it he named me, a covert CIA officer that I was working at the CIA and the wife of Joe Wilson and so forth. I remember like yesterday, and I will never forget what that day was like, because my entire life changed. Joe came into our bedroom, tossed the paper on the bed, and he said, well, he did it. And, except there were a whole lot of other really bad words in there. But so I looked at the column, and I immediately knew there are moments in your life where you know everything going forward is different than what has ever gone before. In the next room were my 3-year-old babies sleeping. I'm worried about their physical security. I'm worried about the assets, my network of assets that I had built up and worked with over the years, because they're now associated to me. They are in jeopardy, deep jeopardy. And I'm worried that, well, it's obvious it's obvious my covert career is over. And it just felt like a punch in the gut. In times of high stress, I retreat to what I sometimes do best, which is write little notes down on sticky, those little yellow Post-it notes. And I started writing down like what I needed to do with my assets and my cases and so forth. That began what I can only describe as sort of a trip down Alice's rabbit hole, where white is black and black is white. My entire career had been predicated on being discreet, that no one would know my name. I would certainly, and I never wanted to be a public person. And all of a sudden I'm hearing about these people, Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson. They're on TV and they're in newspapers and the radio, and they actually have nothing to do with who we are or our characters or what. It became so distorted so quickly. And if I guess there's any silver lining at all, it would be that this was really before the golden heyday, where we are now of social media. I can't even imagine that. I was called every name in the book. Both of us were. We were called liars and traitors. I was accused of nepotism because I had sent my husband to that garden spot of Niger. A member of Congress called me a glorified secretary, I guess because I'm a girl. And it just became an intensely partisan political scandal. Looking back, I really feel like I was in shock for a couple years, honestly. And in some ways, I think maybe just the timing was such that what happened to us in many ways became a proxy for American sentiment about the war. It went through a lot of political machinations. I'll spare you the details. There's a lot of ink spilled on this. But what happened, where it ended up was that in 2007, the Vice President Cheney Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby, was convicted on 4 out of 5 counts in relation to the leak of my name. The most important count to me was obstruction of justice. The prosecutor could not get to the bottom of what happened, and that there was, what he said when it was all said and done, a cloud over the office of the vice president. I resigned from the CIA in 2007. I felt the best job I ever had was over and done. I didn't have any desire to stay, just too much water under the bridge. I thought my promotion chances had slimmed considerably. So I resigned, and my family and I moved from Washington, D.C. to where we are now in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we started to rebuild our lives professionally and personally. Just last April, so a year ago, this month, President Trump pardoned Scooter Libby. What had happened was his sentence was commuted. He paid a fine, but President Trump actually pardoned him. And so a lot of people ask me, well, what do you think about that? What do you make of that? And my answer was, this pardon has nothing to do with Scooter Libby, nothing to do with me, and I think had everything to do with sending a certain message that he will take care of the people he needs to take care of. Despite all of that, and I never thought truly these words would come out of my mouth, but I am actually considering returning to public service and running for public office. There's both a House seat and a Senate seat that are open in New Mexico. So I'm considering that very carefully right now. I'm intrigued by the idea of serving my country again. Got curtailed a little bit before I was ready to last time. I want to turn now and talk just briefly, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for your questions afterwards. I want to tell you about the lessons I learned from those whirlwind Alice in Wonderland years. I'm definitely older, a little bit wiser now. I want to talk about 3 lessons I learned about leadership, because in the CIA, when you screw up, not always, but sometimes someone can actually die. And the first lesson in that is give credit to the most junior people on your team and expose them to senior leadership. For example, I was an up-and-coming ops officer, and I got a prized opportunity to brief the director of the CIA. It was on a highly compartmentalized covert action program against a rogue nuclear state. I was so nervous. My knees were actually knocking. I was given about 2 hours to prepare, and we went in. I answered the questions to the best of my ability. I survived. And at the end of that, my confidence just soared. I thought, I can do that. But even better was the big boss thought more of my boss for allowing me to be able to brief him. And my boss earned my loyalty forever for allowing me to do that. So please keep that in mind as you're in your workplaces. There's plenty of credit to go around. It was a great lesson for me. And I've tried to follow that example wherever I can going forward. Second lesson, diverse teams always equal better outcomes. And I observed firsthand what the addition of diversity to a meeting or a team can do. For example, think of the Osama bin Laden takedown team. It took several female analysts, a group of tough SEAL Team 6 guys, many local informants. It was a cast of thousands to bring down Osama bin Laden. This team did not look alike, they didn't think alike, but it was successful in finding and killing Osama bin Laden in the most extensive manhunt in history. McKinsey research has found that gender diverse boards report, wait for it, 91% higher earnings and 36 higher stock prices. Let me be clear, when I talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about gender diversity. I'm talking about religion, ethnicity, sexuality, and maybe just as importantly, cognitive diversity. Let me give you a brief example in corporate history that perfectly illustrates what happens when there is no diversity of thought. So in 1959, Xerox copier came out, took the world by storm. In 1960, sales were 40 million. In 62, sales increased by 70%. By 1970, they had reached $3 billion. That's in 1970 dollars. Fortune magazine called this copier the most successful product ever marketed in America. But at that peak moment, no one said, wait a minute, we need to hear some other voices? Xerox had no idea what to do next. The company began making blunder after blunder, and they ignored the rush of the oncoming Japanese copier market. And what they did, Xerox was growing so big, the company hired legacy industrial managers, and they had no idea how to compete with the new wave of organizations that were springing up to counter the Xerox copier. So the result was that just 25 years after launching the copier, instead of owning that space, the CEOs, hands up, they had totally missed out on the tech revolution. And I have to think that this scenario would have been very different if the company had paid attention to complexity and diversity in its staff, and especially seeking out those who didn't think like the rest of the crowd. Last one. Take responsibility always, but especially when things go south. I was part of the team that took down A.Q. Khan. If you don't know who he is, very briefly, he's a Pakistani nuclear entrepreneur that without him, we really wouldn't have to worry too much about Iran or North Korea's nuclear program. The operation that did that was complex, took years, huge teamwork. And it was ultimately very successful. But there was a moment when my team leader made a call, and it turned out to be very, very wrong. Thank goodness no one was killed, but it could have ended that way. What impressed me most, though, is immediately he didn't blame others, he didn't push it off in all the other ways we all know how to do to avoid taking responsibility. He owned up to it right away, and let me tell you, it had the impact of his team looking up to him. We would go into battle for him because he owned it, he took it, and we knew that he would do the same for us. It made a huge impression on me. So today I had the great fortune to attend Professor Olson's class, and then in the middle of the day it was Women, Peace, and Security, a seminar. I have to tell you, I was so impressed, and I'm not just saying that to be nice. It really, this is why I do love to come and to speak with colleges, because I feel like maybe we're not completely, doomed, because they're smart and idealistic and bright. And when I hear how going around the room asking what these students are going to do and what they're thinking about, I am so impressed. I was pretty much clueless at their age. I kind of knew more of what I didn't want to do than what I wanted to do. So if you are from the community here this evening, you are so lucky to have this resource in your backyard and these students in your midst. And if you're a student here this evening and you attend Texas A&M, good for you. I mean, I've never been here before. This is my first visit to Aggieland, and I have loved it, and you've been so kind. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Before starting the questions, I would like to announce that after the questions, Ms. Plame will make a brief appearance in the overflow room. Say hello to the crowd over there. Thank you very much, Valerie. These questions are terrific. I'm very impressed by the quality of the questions. I think you can handle them.
What's your favorite color?
Yeah. Let's start with this one. How accurate was the movie Fair Game? And were you happy with the way Naomi Watts portrayed you?
I would say overall, the film was an accurate portrayal of what happened. Obviously, a little Hollywoodized in that events are compressed and some composite characters, but by and large, it wasn't foolish. I wasn't ashamed of it at all. Doug Liman, who's the director, he did Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and he did The Bourne Identity, among others. He just released the director's cut, and that's on Netflix. He just released it last fall, and we did some press for that. And it was really touching to me because he said this was his favorite film of all. It meant so much to him. He felt that it wasn't quite right when it first came out, and he wanted to, he likened it to if you're an artist and you've painted a painting and it's hanging in your client's living room, and you knock on the door and you're there with a paint can and brush going, I want to do just a little bit more. And that's what he felt like it was doing on the director's cut. So yeah, I think it's a very bizarre experience having a film. The whole thing is just so weird, but at least it was, Naomi Watts, right?
Have you received any threats since you left the CIA, and do you have any concerns about your safety now?
So actually, when at a peak of madness, and this was 2004, so the outing was 2003, 2004, if you recall, presidential election year, the noise was getting, the noise around this was incredible. there was a credible threat against myself, John Ashcroft, and George Tenet. John Ashcroft was a justice, right? Yeah, Attorney General. George Tenet was the head of the CIA. Oh, and Karl Rove. We all had, from the same source, very sort of American Al-Qaeda, very, it was scary. And I was scared most of all for my small children. So I went, the sad story is, I went to head of security at CIA, and I said, I'm very concerned about this. Would you consider some extra security on my residence just until we get through like sort of the presidential election period? I mean, a couple months. I'm not talking lifetime protection here. And they said, okay, well, we'll investigate. And they came back after a week. They said, no, no. And I was so, it felt like another betrayal all over again, because I didn't feel that my request was so resource rich, or, I mean, I was in, this whole story was in the papers and on TV, it was everywhere, and again, when you have small children, I mean, I would kill someone with my bare hands if they did, harm my child. And it was just really disappointing that the powers that be did not step up and go, we'll take care of it.
Valerie, what was your reaction to President Trump's pardoning of Scooter Libby last year?
I think I commented on that in my remarks. Not about me, not about Scooter Libby, all about the message he was sending to his circle. And I'll leave it at that.
How do your friends and former colleagues at the CIA feel about you and your actions after 2003?
Well, I guess they still like me because they come, what Professor Olson spoke about, what I'm starting up is something called Spies, Lies, and Nukes. It was a 2-day espionage conference just this last fall in Santa Fe. I called up or emailed my former colleagues, some of the best ones, really highly decorated. I said, you want to come to Santa Fe and talk about espionage? And they all jumped at it. So they must. I feel fortunate that they know better than anyone what the cost of this all has been. But the Spies, Lies, and Nukes conference that I want to grow, we talked about everything from Russian interference in the elections to nukes, my thing, to how the CIA recruits assets, cyber warfare. It was so cool, I have to say.
Knowing what you do now, would you recommend that a young person today consider a career in the CIA?
I get asked that a lot, as you might imagine. And I have to say, despite what happened to me, I absolutely would encourage a young person to consider this public service. First of all, we really need the best and the brightest. Keep sending them off to Washington because we have big challenges. I was disappointed maybe 2 years ago. I spoke at the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Highfalutin, really smart kids there. And I asked for a show of hands, who was considering going into public service? Doesn't have to be the CIA, just in general. And there was like one hand in a class of 75, and it made me sad that in many cases I feel that government work has been so denigrated. The great joke, which is haha, which we're from the government, we're here to help you. That kind of puts down such hard-working, really decent people that certainly in the CIA are trying to keep the world safe for democracy, and I want to see fresh young blood coming in. Keep sending them.
The Bush School is doing its part.
All right.
What's your impression of Gina Haspel, the new director of the CIA? Did you know her personally?
I do not know her personally. We came in at the same time. We have mutual friends, but our paths just never crossed. I say it's about time that there's a woman head of the CIA. I was impressed that in the wake of the killing of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, that she got on an airplane, flies to Turkey, speaks to their intelligence service, in Turkish language, where she had learned, and came back to brief Congress. I mean, that's pretty kick-ass if you ask me. I just wish, and this is just me, I wish that the first woman did not have any taint of black sites or enhanced interrogation techniques that clearly she does.
Did you have any trouble getting your book Fair Game approved by the CIA?
Oh, there should be a movie on that. Yeah, it's heavily redacted. That's another sad story. When I wrote my book, I just wanted to be treated fairly. I wanted to tell my story. We are professional intelligence officers. We would never, ever compromise or jeopardize sources or methods. But I wanted to tell my story. But my story and me and the whole thing was still so politically radioactive that when I submitted my manuscript to the PRB, Publication Review Board at the CIA, so they can sign off on it, they said, well, first problem is you can't say publicly that you were affiliated with the CIA prior to 2002. So what, I fell from the sky? What was I do? I mean, it was truly nonsensical. And then they redacted, and I'll just give you an example, because this is, I might still have another shot at this, to reform that whole process, which is capricious. It doesn't do anything to protect our national security. But let me give you an example. For instance, they redacted chief of station, among many, many other things. I couldn't say the chief of station did that. It wasn't identified. And yet, previously, they had allowed a book written by a case officer to be published, and its title was, wait for it, Chief of Station. So I totally appreciate how hard their job is, but it was a really painful process, and I felt betrayed all over again. What can I say? I mean, if I was George Tenet, not a problem. No. But I'm not George Tenet, so there you go.
Valerie, I enjoyed Blowback and Burned. Will there be any more Vanessa Pearson books?
Oh, I'm so glad you did. Whoever wrote that, thank you. Actually, I've just been contacted about making that into a TV series, which I would love, because the female heroine, Vanessa Pearson, is not a cardboard character of the CIA sexy girl, right? She's actually got something going on there, and much more realistic. So I would love if there was a portrayal of that got away from the, what I wore for work every day was a sequin gown. Right? You like that?
I missed that.
I know, yeah. I would have stood out in the hallways, yeah.
What's your assessment of the current state of U.S. intelligence?
I'll try to make it short. I will make it short. It really bothers me incredibly that there's such daylight between the president and the intelligence community. We all know the things that have been said that are really hurtful. But what's worse is it is detrimental. I can't even imagine how hard it must be to be working for this administration overseas, where you're constantly trying to explain, well, the president really meant this. I mean, I'm not going to go on and on, but even if you're a huge supporter of him, the truth is that it's really hard for. He doesn't always say what he means or mean what he says, right? And this is compounded in the world of intelligence. It must be incredibly hard, and we've had our liaison partners, the intelligence services around the world with whom we're allied and have been for decades and decades, and share lots of intelligence, and we work together very well collaboratively on terrorism and other mutually compatible targets. Those relationships have really taken a beating, and you can't just easily repair them.
I like this question. What was your proudest moment in your career that you can talk about?
Ooh. Gosh, I can't speak to specifics, but I think I mentioned this. And all of us in the intelligence community would say this, because no one should know your name. You're making a pretty modest salary. But there are days when you know that you actually made a difference. Maybe something you wrote or someone you recruited or something has ended up on the president's desk, or you know it made a real change in policy. And those are moments when you're like, I earned my salary today. And it doesn't happen all the time, but you know when they do. And as I said, I never, ever, ever wanted to be a public person. And fate has handed me this. But the highest praise came from my former colleague. If Rolf saw something I did, he said, "Good job, Val." That's all I need, the attaboy from someone you respect. The rest is all just sparkly stuff.
Yeah. How do you balance being a spy with having a family life?
Like every working mother, you never think that you're giving enough or the best to whatever is in front of you. I will say this: I had a lot of career before I had babies. I had babies late, and it was. I had recruited people. I had done all sorts of interesting things. The hardest job was coming home with I had twins, bringing them home. I'm like, you're kidding? You want me to take care of them? Yeah, I had no idea. Trust me. We talked about this a little bit today in the Women, Peace, Conflict, International Security seminar, whatever, that as a whole, our society still has a long ways to go to trying to provide quality and affordable child care. How much more study and research do we need to show that if that were part of our fabric, how our productivity would just leap off the charts, because more women could go in and stay in the workforce knowing that their children, you had quality child care that was affordable. But I digress, yes.
Okay, Valerie, here we go. What is your view of our current president's support or non-support of the CIA today?
Again, the daylight between the president and the intelligence community is always a bad thing for our national security. Apparently, the whole intelligence community, there was only one customer, and that real customer, and that customer was the President of the United States. And we always have to figure out how do we best present information for that customer. And this varies from president to president. It's because we all learn and take in information differently. But what is distressing is what we hear is that this particular president really doesn't want to hear much at all. And my area of passion and interest is always in the nuclear realm, and it's painful to me because I believe we've gone backwards in that. We could have a whole other conversation on the Iraq nuclear deal and so forth, but I will leave you with this comment on that, which is I don't care what you are engaged in that you find meaning, whether it's early childhood education, whether it's gun control, whether it's immigration policies, whatever. I don't care what it is. If you do not get the nuclear one correct, none of the other ones matter. And this administration and this president in particular has given that such back of the hand, rather impulsive reactions, is what I would say.
How do you recover from such a betrayal? And did President Bush or anyone else apologize to you for what happened?
No apologies. Not expected. This is the truth. When going through something like what Joe Wilson and I did, it's just it's like a distorting funhouse mirror sense, and it went on for years. The best thing was that our kids were really small at the time, and if any of you have had little kids, you know that they really don't care how your day was. They just want a snack and your love, and that keeps you balanced. I mean, there were days when, of course, you don't want to get out of bed. The newspaper, the Washington Post, would land with a thud on our doorstep. Is that such an anachronism now? Like, who gets a newspaper at their doorstep now? But you'd open it up and you'd read about these really terrible people, Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson, and they're traitorous. This is our like hometown paper, right? How do you balance that? And you don't. You're like, okay, we're going to have pancakes for breakfast today.
Please comment on the ethics of advanced interrogation techniques like waterboarding.
When this came to light, that the CIA was doing this, that the US government was doing this, and I hasten to add, I don't know if this is good, bad, or indifferent, but it was contractors, but contracted to the CIA. In the aftermath of 9/11, under the so-called 1% doctrine, I believe this to be absolutely antithetical to who we are as a people, our Constitution. This is not who we believe we are, and we did it anyway, and we still have yet to reconcile ourselves to that. I find it abhorrent, and okay, put aside the whole moral question of is that the right thing to do or not. It's also not effective. Over and over and over again, we know this. Torture does not work. And even though what was that? Was it Zero Dark 30? Was that
Zero Dark 30.
Yeah. So Zero Dark 30 gave the impression that a torture episode led almost click, click, click to the discovery of bin Laden and where he was. That's not true. That's a distortion. That was a fantasy of the filmmaker. This is my personal feeling that torture does not work. People will say anything under torture to make it stop. And I think we're better than that. And I think as a people, we still need to come to terms with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think this is a very appropriate question to end with, Valerie.
Uh-huh.
What advice do you have for a young woman seeking to enter the intelligence community?
Do so. Go, lead. And the absolute minute that you as a woman have any sense of responsibility or ownership of agency of what you're doing, you must turn around and extend your hand and make sure the next woman behind you is pulled up too. I would just like to say thank you so much for your time and attention this evening. It really has been a pleasure to get to know this part of Texas, and I hope maybe I'll get asked back.
You certainly will.
Okay.
And thank you, Valerie, very much.